So we're going to move in. We've got a little bit of time for people to think about any questions they have or to express what key messages that emerge from this session are for people. At some point, my colleague Susan's going to put a link to a self-evaluation in it as well, just so you can do feedback on the session. So if you could do that, click on that link before you finish, before you leave the session, that would be helpful. Okay, I'm going to take the slides down so we can actually see each other. And the first question that's come in the chart is from Isabel Henderson about, can you signpost the 5 ways to wellbeing? And maybe say a wee bit more about it as well. But that's new to her. So I don't know which one if you want to take that on. But
it's a sort of framework we're using through NEF, and it's basically looking at connection, keeping learning, people being active and giving and taking notice of the communities. So it's a framework we use around young people and adults and in family settings. So I can certainly send a link, and it is very useful.
Vary, if you could send that to myself, that would be great, because as I say, we'll send the slideshow out to people, the presentation out to people, probably in a week or 2. So if you can send that to me, we can attach that with an email and people can see that. Okay, so we've got a comment in from Pam. Pam, I don't know if you want to just say it, say what you're thinking.
Yeah, just listening to this just reinforces that, whether it be PEF money or whichever funding stream comes down, that we need to get away from short-term funding and short-term contracts, because, as you say, it takes years sometimes to build relationships with families and young people. And I think sometimes schools have an expectation that process will be a lot quicker than it actually is. So it's really refreshing to hear you, Mrs. Jarvin, saying that, it's taken you a couple of years or so to actually see the benefit of the strategy you took within your schools. So yeah, that was really good to hear. So that was my only comment on that.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll open it up, and has anybody got any questions for myself, for Susan or Vary or Laura, for any of us, or indeed thoughts that you want to share about the work that you're doing in your own locality as well?
So one of the things that I mentioned, Alona, was around the self-evaluation that Edinburgh had come up with, and I know you're here, Karen, and I don't mean to pick on you, but I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about that process, how easy it might have been, how difficult, barriers, whatever.
Hi. Thanks for that amazing presentation. I've heard about it. I've heard about this project before, and I'm delighted to hear about it again. So I think I could say a lot, but you've asked me about something else. So, the evaluation. We used we recently did some work with the read write count bags, the primary 3 read write count bags, and through that and some of the other projects that we've done in Edinburgh, we've created an evaluation tool that has used some of the challenge questions in the 2.5 family learning and also the 2.7 partnerships. So we've picked some of the questions from that, but we've turned them into actions, intended impacts, actual impacts, etc. So we used that with this. Most recently, we've used that with this piece of work around interactive sessions around the read write count bags. It's been helpful. It's been a helpful tool. I've also noticed that there was the what Ilona was talking about was the CLD upcoming framework, not framework, but yeah, the CLD one, which had, and I had actually noted down, as you'd mentioned, the one about intergenerational work, and I had also thought that the 2.2b adult learning mentioned, no, where is it? It says, are our family-focused projects engaging families from a range of social and cultural backgrounds well? So I think that would apply to if that's still in there. It was in one draft, I don't know if it's still in there. I would be keen to use that in future, and also, the rest of that one. So it's not been easy to do it, I have to say, in answer to your question, Susan. It's not been that easy to do it, but we're finding that it's, as long as we don't use too many, as long as we're not picking too many, then and is there somebody there to support because I've got a strategic role and I'm not actually delivering. I have found that when people are delivering, it's really hard to do all that in any detail as well. So it's fine-tuning it to make it simpler is what we're needing to do.
Thanks, Karen. I would suggest people pick 1 or 2 teams to start with. This is huge suggestion.
I'm happy to share that if anyone's interested in that, the one that we've done more recently. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks, Karen. Sorry to pick on you, but I knew that you went through that process.
I'm happy to make connections though about it. Absolutely. Yes.
I think Julie was wanting to speak now. So, Karen, can you put your mute button on? A wee bit of feedback. Thank you.
I was just going to say, Susan, that Karen and Barbara very kindly shared their self-evaluation process with us after the 3rd session, and that was sent out. So I can pass that on to Alona and make sure that that's sent out with the 4th session as well. So in case you missed the last one, you can have it from this one too.
Thanks, Julie. That'd be really helpful, I think, for people. And I think Karen, Alona had touched on something that I think is quite important, and that's about not making it too complicated. I would imagine you would agree with that.
Me, yeah, I would. Karen, yes, I would. Yes, I would agree with that.
I think we all would. Yes. So, is anyone got any other questions? Sorry, Alona.
No, I was just going to say, as people think of their questions, I know as inspectors, people quite often expect us to come in looking for everything to be covered. And we really don't. What we're really looking for is clarity of purpose, so that you're, from the start, you're saying, okay, this is what we want to achieve. This we think we can achieve in 6 months, but this we know is going to take 2 or 3 years. But that you've got your eye on the ball. But also that you're listening to the young people, the children, the parents and carers that are involved, so that as what they're wanting to achieve might change, that actually that you adjust that or incorporate that into your evaluation, into your outcome planning, so that it's not a static thing. There may be some elements that are really core, because you may, for example, have if you're in a school setting, you might have a real issue over attendance, and you might go, actually, that's one of the core things that we really want to improve from this, just to pick a random example. But there will be other outcomes that come on board as you progress and as your programme develops. And so certainly as an inspector, when I'm coming in and looking at family learning, that's what I would be expecting to see. Something that is responsive, but also is well planned from the outset in terms of thinking about where could this take us? How could our families be different in a year's time? How could the children in school be different in a year's time in terms of their confidence to learn and their readiness to learn? I don't know if there's anything additional that Laura wants to add to that or something. I was noticing her taking notes and nodding her head. And like Susan was saying, if anybody's got any other questions, happy to pass them on. We may have stunned everyone into silence.
I think it's when you tell them it's getting filmed. I think that's the I think that's the issue sometimes. I think one of the things that is interesting as well is the longitudinal impact that potentially, research tells us that they certainly have found. I know that Gail MacLeod and Lynn Tett from Edinburgh did a 10-year longitudinal study and showed that family learning had an impact. Is there anything, so I'm just thinking about the last input, I'm just thinking about the mapping. Are you going to track any of the children? Is there plans?
Is that for me? Is that for
yes.
me? Question?
Yes.
Yeah. So we are obviously, we're tracking all our children all the time. So what I'm able to see now is that, I've tracked these children for 4 or 5 years, and now it's starting to have an impact. So it is after several years that we're starting to see an impact on the children. So I have been able to do that, and sometimes that's just quite simplistic in terms of looking at something like a reading age, just attainment in general. Are they on track for their learning? and they've not been on track for primary 2 and
except
primary
from
3 and primary 4. And quite often when that pattern starts, it's very difficult to turn that around. But what we have seen is in some of these cases that we are turning it around. And the stories there in the background is, the most powerful thing is actually talking to the families and hearing their story, because that's the most powerful thing. But for me as the head teacher, I'm being asked to provide evidence of impact. And I can't really summarise these stories into a nice simple document or something. So I'm able to actually show impact in a really simplistic way just by their attainment. You can see it quite clearly. And I've got other examples of children, particularly children who've showed really distressed and challenging behaviours, and saying that they're showing really distressed and challenging behaviours every day, and then gradually it's maybe once a week, and then it's just as those relationships build, it starts to minimise. So I've got examples of that, and children who've maybe been struggling to maintain a placement in a mainstream school, and have maybe went on now to secondary mainstream and are having success, but for a period of time in primary school they've needed something else for a couple of years. So I've got some evidence of that as well.
I think that's really impactful, and I think for others it's good to see that link to attainment, because it's always been in research, but actually having that hard data is very, very powerful. I'm just wondering about the tracking of the parents' progression as well. Is that going to sound? Yep.
Yeah, well, with the transformative evaluation, we have a method where when they're ready, we can share the journey. So we keep a timeline at their request. It's been difficult because digital has been good. It's actually got some information back that we might not have had from some families, but we don't have the same input in terms of a sort of adult learning plan that leads to family learning. But what we've been able to do is look at this timeline of learning, and Laura and I often sit and share where parents have permitted me to do so, and they can go back to that. And this is what we feel difficult, and certainly in CLD's role, our practice often is really hard to evaluate, at that end game, because you're talking about people's lived experiences and it's their story to share. And often what you have to do is take them back to a point they don't want taken back to, just to get that evidence to see the difference. And what transformative evaluation does is it makes me do that with them. Yeah. I have to go through the whole process and show why I thought the way I thought, and reflect on the choices I made in the journey that I had with the parent. So it's really empowering for the parent, and they feel more inclined to share, and it doesn't necessarily take them back. It makes them recognise their own learning, and when they notice the difference, that we know we've actually made an impact, and their attitude to learning changes, and they realise why. It's not just happening, but they realise why. So in tracking, it's actually left to them. They should have all the things we find, and we're finding ways of doing that through these processes.
I love that. It's the mindset change, isn't it? The change in attitudes to learning. Isabel Henderson's got a wee question. I don't know if you want to come in, Isabel. You still there, Isabel?
Maybe I have a problem.
Hi, yes, I am. No, it was just really a question which isn't really a self-evaluation question, but I'm a PT in the secondary sector. So, it's really encouraging, really enjoyed hearing from Ms. Jarvie about that impact and what's happening, and a recognition that it can take years and is a really important intervention. There are times, particularly when you're more involved in maybe the subject than directly in family learning or pastoral care, I think there's more of an issue that you may end up that you're trying to pick up. There may have been a lot of break between any kind of positive impact for families in an early years setting, and by the time there's been a significant breakdown of trust or relationship by the time they're in secondary, whether really there's any advice in terms of how to bridge that gap. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm going to come in, and I don't know if I'm going to answer what you're saying, but I was just going to say, for me, they're always my children, you know, they'll always be my children that've come to this school. And Barry's actually still working with a couple of families that have no longer got children at my school. But we recognised that continuity was really important, because essentially it's the right thing to do. It was the right thing. It's the right thing for me to do, to make sure that Barry continues to support them. In actual fact, Barry said for one of the families, there's a sibling that will be, that's been born and is probably going to come this way soon. So it is about that whole family learning approach, because I'm not just going to cut that off because they go to high school. One of the things we were doing pre-COVID was we were given, and it was a big pressure on me in terms of resourcing, but I was trying to give, there's often transition, you'll know that yourself, comes into primary to help the children move on to secondary. But what we were saying was it needs to happen the other way as well, in terms that we're still available for these children when they move on to secondary school. And I would say we've not been able to do that so well, and I know from my local high school that some of the first years have struggled this year, and just what you're saying, things are sort of breaking down. And I think there's something about almost creating an outreach hub within the primaries, within those local communities, because my primary school serves a community that is here, and the high school takes in such a wide range of communities within this local area. It's a slightly different thing, and the approach that Barry has in this school would be different in some of the schools that are within the same cluster as me. So I think there's something about that local context as well that's really important.
Can I add, Laura, if it's okay, just that also from the parent's point of view, their most recent experience of education is senior school, is high school, and that's the most negative comments that come through to the children, is their experiences of that. We've had to sort of strip back some of the comments that parents make to young people when they're transitioning up to high school, and I think it's really important to keep that link going, and also to be aware that there is a disconnect for families when their children go to high school. There's not as much involvement and parental involvement within high school. Although there is digitally, it's not always easy to maintain. They don't get along to sports things, they don't get to certain things, and they were just starting to do those things for the first time possibly in their P5, 6 and 7 years. So there's a bit of work that needs to jump from both camps.
Alona, I don't know if you want to say something about Larbert and this, because that's a secondary school that really has won awards for their family learning.
Yeah, in the same area as Carrinshaw. So yes. Larbert High School do have they do quite a bit of family learning, particularly around some of the STEM aspects. But I was also going to say some of the secondary schools that are perhaps more have a more forward-looking approach to this are beginning to have very clear parental engagement plans within their school development plans. And I do wonder whether the last year actually, in a strange way, may have helped with some of that, because what's really been clear over the last year is just how crucial the parent role is in terms of children and young people's development and successful progression. But also because parents in most areas have had to link in with schools, and schools have had to link in with parents, because particularly during the periods of lockdown, when the children were actually physically learning at home. And so I think there's probably a window of opportunity perhaps to actually push out the parent engagement aspects of things in secondary schools, and then many bits of family learning might come from that. There's probably scope to do it the other way, to start with the family learning and build on that to do the parent engagement, where there's fun family learning like cooking and like some of the STEM activities, etc., that Larbert do. But yes, that would be my thought. Actually, it's like, do we have a real strategy for this? Have we actually thought through how we're going to approach this? Because how we're doing it in secondary 1 may be very different to how we're doing it once children and young people reach the senior phase, and they're beginning to think about the sort of next steps post-school, which is when parent engagement tends to come in again. There quite often is that gap in years 1 to 3. So that would be my advice, is actually for secondary schools to increasingly start to think about where do we place our parent engagement and how do we do it and who's involved, and do we have a whole school approach? Do we have a lead person? Actually, how are we going to do this? How are we going to work with the parent council on this as well? Hope that's of help.